So welcome to the third episode of Wolf School, everyone. We're just going to let you all sign in here, and please do use the chat and let us know where you're calling in from. We're always thank you. So someone's calling in there from New York, from Halliburton. I always find this part really exciting. From Toronto, Denver, Colorado. And once we've had a few more of you sign in, what we'll do is I'll do some introductions, and just know that as we go through this, please feel free to ask any questions. We'll try and take some as we go along, and we'll do our best to make some time at the end for you to ask questions, and do feel free to ask whatever you like. You can post them in the chat, or you can post them in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to track those. So I'm seeing Quebec, Chicago, Vancouver Island, New Jersey, Ohio, Japan. I think that's probably the most exotic so far. Maine, Sydney, Oregon. So I'm going to give the other person that you can see here is Heather Bryan. I'm going to give Heather a full introduction. She's going to be really our feature for the evening, and be telling us a little bit more about what science can tell us about the wolves of British Columbia in particular. So we're looking forward to that. And I think tonight we might get started a little bit more promptly, just because there's always so much to cover, and I'd rather spend our time on that. So please do continue to let us know where you're calling in from in the chat there. And what I'd like to do is just let you know who I am. So my name is Ross Dixon. I work for the Raincoast Conservation Foundation. Raincoast mission is all about protecting the land, waters and wildlife of coastal British Columbia. And we've started this wolf school in collaboration with the Wolf Conservation Center in New York. Really is a way of helping broaden the public understanding of wolves. Whilst we have a focus particularly on the wild wolves of British Columbia, we also wanted to provide a pretty broad spectrum of people to talk to. So that's why we partnered with the Wolf Conservation Center. We've heard from a couple of wolf scientists already. And next week, we're going to be speaking with a conservation photographer, Christina Mittermeier. We have a whole episode dedicated to Indigenous perspectives on wolves. And the last session will focus on wolf conservation. And so with that in mind, like, even though we're online, I'm calling in here from the territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh and Musqueam nations. So we just want to give that territorial acknowledgement as we start, and we will have someone from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation who's going to join us in our fifth episode to help give us some different perspectives on wolves. So with that, I wanted to give you a bit of a sense of who Heather is, and Heather's going to be, like I said, be giving us a bit of a sense of her research and insights into how hunting affects stress in wolves, the distinct genetic makeup of coastal wolves, disease transmission, so a whole range of topics. And Heather is now assistant professor of ecosystem science and management at the University of Northern British Columbia. She holds a Bachelor of Science with honours degree in biology with a major in environmental studies with distinction from the University of Victoria. And for her honours thesis, this is all relevant. What she studied salmon-derived nutrients in riparian forests working with Dr. Tom Rankin. And Heather went on to get her PhD in veterinary medical sciences at the University of Calgary. And following that, she worked in the Hakai Raincoast Lab. So that's the Raincoast Applied Conservation Lab at the University of Victoria. And Heather's now working at UNBC, as I mentioned before. So Heather, I'm glad that it's time to get to you. And you and I know each other really from your days and your work with Raincoast. And as I mentioned before, I kind of distinctly remember, I'm not sure if they were your stories or other people's stories of you riding up and down Forest Service roads on mountain bikes on the lookout for wolf scat. And that whole topic seems to be a key piece for your research. And I'm just wondering if you could give us a little bit of a sense of how did you make that initial connection to Raincoast and to the study of wolves?
Sure, thank you, Ross. Well, it's a pleasure to be here tonight. And as you mentioned, I'm joining you from Lheidli-T'enneh Traditional Territory and UNBC, University of Northern British Columbia campus. And so I've been a raincoaster, I'd say, for almost 20 years, and goes back to when I was an undergraduate at the University of Victoria. I was probably in my second year of university at that time, and I was looking for ways to enrich my experience at the university and get involved with research for the first time. And so I was walking through the biology building, and I remember seeing a poster that Chris Darramont had put up. At the time, he was a PhD student working with Tom Rankin and Paul Piquet, and he was looking for volunteers. I thought that would be a really interesting way of getting involved with research on campus. So I signed up eagerly, and my first task was something that seems pretty, pretty low tech compared to how we do science today. But what he did is he sent me and another volunteer to the library, and he was looking at swimming distances of wolves between islands. And today you'd open your computer and you get out a map, and probably you'd get the computer to do some calculations for you. Back then we used rulers, so we actually got out the physical maps at the library, and we used rulers to measure the shortest distance that we could find between different islands around the coast. And so that was a really interesting piece of the work that Chris and colleagues did, trying to understand how much these coastal wolves use marine waterways, and how much they can cross among islands and on the coast. Yeah. So that I wasn't deterred. After that first task, I signed up for more. And the next thing I did was to volunteer to work on some scats, some wolf scats that Chris had collected. And so this involved, so to work with wolf scats, you have to be pretty careful. They can have some serious parasites that are health concerns to people. So the first thing you have to do is put them in the oven and basically cook them for a few hours to make sure that you kill any parasites that are in there. And so I remember sneaking into the biology room one evening and throwing all the wolf scats into the oven, and it's called an autoclave, in the basement of the biology building. And I just turned it on for 3 hours, and I went upstairs to my class, to a night class. I had a night class in the biology building. And I remember sitting in class, and this warm aroma started filling the room. The smell of cooking scats took over the whole biology building. And I remember other students looking around and kind of complaining about this smell. And I just sat quietly in my seat, not saying anything, knowing that it was me that had polluted the air that night. So once the scats are cooked and they cool down, the next step is that all of the volunteers would take them upstairs to the top floor, from the basement of the biology building to the top floor of the biology building. And we go into the little scat room. And to get there, you had to walk through all the machinery and these kind of noisy machines through this really dark, pitch dark, big open room. And you walk into this tiny little room that was full of scats, but also it was the taxidermy room. And so I remember we'd be in there for hours preparing these scat samples for analysis to figure out what the wolves were eating. So it wasn't the most glamorous work, but it was a really neat way of getting involved with some hands-on research experience.
And I was picking up from, I was flicking through, I was doing my homework as you're supposed to do for Wolf School, obviously. And I was picking up this line in one of the papers around this idea of facts from feces, which I'm sure somebody coined, and it's pretty memorable. And I'm wondering, you just mentioned a little bit about like that, you know, that we can, like that analysis can help us determine like obviously diet, but I'm kind of curious if you can tell us a little more about what we're able to start to understand from, like, learn from wolves from that study of scat.
Right. So a lot of us consider scat to be waste, but for biologists, it's just this treasure trove of information that you can learn about the animals. And so obviously the kind of the most basic thing that you can look at is diet. And so after a wolf or another animal has consumed its food, you can look and see what it's been eating. And so for wolves, you look at usually at the hair. Sometimes you use bones, fragments, or you look for little bits of scales or shells or claws, and you can figure out what they've been eating. So diet is kind of the most basic thing, but there's lots more. Another common thing is to look at genetics. So you can get DNA from the scat, and you can identify individuals and tell what sex they are, and lots more. You can also look at parasites that inhabit their gastrointestinal tracts, and you can see what they're infested with that way. You can, by looking at the distribution of scats, you can get an idea of where animals are on the landscape, and sometimes a bit of information about their behavior and use of habitat. And you can look at hormones in the scats, and the amount of information that you can get from scats is ever increasing. People are coming up with all kinds of creative ways of learning from them. So it's really exciting.
And like I think like later on we're going to go into a little bit more of the research. I'm wondering if you could say there's another kind of piece here that might be kind of commonly missed, and I think we've mentioned it on previous episodes that Raincoast has this wildlife welfare ethic approach to our work in terms of considering the welfare of individuals in populations in our work. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about why, like, we chose to use those more non-invasive methods to study wolves, and also, like, because this is a feature of your research, what we know about the effectiveness of, in this context of wolves in particular, of like these more non-invasive research methods.
Yeah, so the nice thing about scats is that you can collect them pretty easily without the animals even knowing that you're there, or if they do know that you're there, they don't, you're not bothering them too much. And that's really a conscious decision by Raincoast, instilled from Paul Piquet, but also from Indigenous partners who really encourage the use of these approaches like scat analysis for studying animals. We know that a lot of the techniques that are commonly used for wildlife research, like capturing and collaring, can have short-term and sometimes even long-term effects on the individuals. And so using those techniques requires a lot of consideration about the benefits of the information in relationship to the costs that it can have on individuals. And so in our particular research, we really consciously made that choice to focus on the non-invasive approaches, and like scat analysis, and now with the bear work, the hair analysis.
And we've got a question here that I think I'll take because it's really relevant. And someone is asking that they may have misunderstood, but the scat, they're asking about the scat and the autoclave, and how can you test DNA and parasites if you've sterilized the scat?
So with the autoclaving, that's if you're specifically using the scats for a dietary analysis, because there you're just focused on usually looking at mammalian prey remains in the scat. So you wash away the rest of the material in the scat, and all you're left with is the bones and the hair. For parasite analysis, we use a different method, which is we freeze the samples at -80 for at least 3 days. And that reduces the risk of parasite transmission. We still take other precautions for parasitology, so we usually work in the fume hood and use gloves, and are a lot more careful working with scat when we're doing parasitology analyses.
Thank you. And please do keep those questions coming. We'll do our best to answer them. Heather, I wanted to kind of move on to a bit that you've mentioned before about, and that Paul spoke about in earlier episodes about the work that helped determine the distinction of the genetics of coastal wolves. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about, like, I mean, I've got lots of notes written here that I'm flicking through, but if you could just tell us about, like, what did we learn about the distinct nature of coastal wolves from those genetic studies?
Yeah, well, that was some really neat work, and it was inspired by our friend and colleague Chester Starr from the Haislik Nation. And Chester really, and hopefully Chris will talk about this story a little more, but basically Chester had observed that there were these differences between wolves on islands and wolves on mainland, even though on the coast these island and mainland areas are separated sometimes by less than a few hundred meters. And so that observation really inspired this genetic work to see whether there were in fact genetic differences between the mainland and island wolf populations. And so again, this was using scats. Scats collected from wolves of known social groups, so different wolf packs. And what the genetics showed is that the wolves living on the island areas were distinct from the wolves that tended to be have home ranges more on the mainland. And that was really novel, at least to science, because that there could be genetic differentiation that occurs over such a short geographic distance, and yet it aligns with the traditional knowledge that Chester shared. It aligns with knowledge of the diet. We know that wolves living on island consume more marine resources compared with wolves on the mainland. And we similarly found that the island wolves had different parasites even from the wolves living on the mainland. And so that is kind of finding of these genetic differences is really important, because it shows that even within these coastal wolves, there's a distinct ecotypes. So ecotypes are specific parts of populations. And so in terms of conservation, it's really important to think not only of the whole population, but also to think about how there's these distinct subpopulations that are maybe ecologically and genetically distinct from each other.
Yeah. There's a couple of questions we're going to take in a second, but I just wanted to ask, so this is one of the pieces that, I mean, you were talking about it in your research. It says that you discovered the presence of a genetic climb between mainland and island wolves. And so can you kind of can you just give us a bit more of a sense of like what that actually means? Is that, like, as I understand it, that means like a trend towards genetic differentiation? Can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I'm not the geneticist on the paper. This paper was led by Astrid Vikstronen, who's a geneticist, and she could do a much better job explaining this than I can. But essentially, if you have a separate species, then there's certain criteria that are met to be a completely different species, and the genetics are quite different. But even within species, you can get genetic differentiation where it means that they're not interbreeding regularly. So it means that there's more breeding within these subpopulations than there is among those subpopulations. And so depending on the degree of isolation, that's when eventually, perhaps down the road, and it may not happen for wolves, but that's kind of the way speciation occurs, is when you start to get genetic differentiation. And if that genetic differentiation is extreme enough, that's when you could lead to speciation eventually. But it's a process.
There's a couple of really great questions that I wanted to ask, and they're kind of and it doesn't matter that they're kind of slightly away from the topic we're talking about right now. But I think this is really key, and it relates to this piece about Chester guided us towards. And the question is, how do you carefully navigate respecting Indigenous knowledge while exploring questions and pieces of knowledge provided by the Indigenous people you work with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really, really important question to think about. And the way I like to think about this piece of research is, I think it's really important not to think of trying to test Indigenous knowledge with science, but in this case, I think it was a really nice example of consilience, where Chesterton shared his Indigenous knowledge, and it inspired a new hypothesis, a hypothesis that was new to science. And so I think, I think it's important to remember that traditional knowledge and science are different ways of knowing. You're not always going to get the same answer, but they're complementary, and both are equally valid ways of learning about systems and learning and knowledge. I think promoting that both as very valid and important bodies of knowledge is really important. And I think this is a really nice example of that kind of consilience. I think obviously, and then related to the other part of that question in terms of ensuring that traditional knowledge is used appropriately, I think in this case, it was done based on this close relationship that Chris and Chester had developed over years of working together. So I think it's really a very careful balance of close interaction and built on a relationship of trust and respect.
Yeah. Thanks for that. That's a great question. And just for the viewers, Chester Starr is someone who's really been critical to our wolf research. Unfortunately, passed away recently. So Chris Darramont will share in a later episode a fuller kind of story about his influence and importance. But just know that the entire series of this Wolf School is dedicated to his memory because he's been so influential, and it relates to that question. So I just wanted to kind of recognize that. There's another quite different question here that I thought would be useful. It related to some of what you were talking about before. And someone's asking, and I'm just summarizing this a little bit, but what are some of the potential negative impacts of collaring and tagging? And you can answer that generally, or if you want to make it specific to wolves, and that's something that you feel is good to answer, that would be great.
Well, it certainly depends on the species and on the capture and collaring approach. But generally, capturing and collaring involves often immobilizing an animal, sometimes injecting it with anesthesia and pain medication, and then sometimes taking out a tooth, putting a collar on, taking a variety of samples, and then releasing that animal. So there can be behavioral responses where animals may stop moving for a while afterwards, and there's various effects there of on the movement. It can last from a short period to several days or several weeks, and then it can there can be it's hard to get at physiological responses, but there can be, there can be physiological responses in terms of stress in some species as well. So that's why people who use more invasive techniques think a lot about trying to minimize the effects on the species that they're looking at, and take a lot of precautions, and protocols are continuously improving and getting better, but it's generally a fairly invasive approach to studying animals.
Thank you. I really like this question. Do wolves on a marine diet have higher longevity?
Good question. No idea.
Okay, that's all right. I think and thanks everyone for these questions. We will.
And I mean, just to add to that, it would be it is a really interesting question, but a hard one to answer, especially if you don't have collars on the animals, and you wouldn't know when an animal died necessarily.
So we're gonna shift to like another part of your research here, Heather, in terms of something Paul spoke up a little bit about in terms of the ecological role of wolves and disease regulation, and I know that disease and disease transmission is a feature of your work, and I wonder if you could share a little bit about why this topic was important. Like, I know you've looked at the disease transmission from like dogs to wolves and so on and so forth. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about why this topic of disease transmission is relevant to wolves.
Well, we know wolves have many ecological roles in ecosystems, and often we think of their role in regulating prey populations, so keeping prey numbers low, and that has cascading effects on ecosystems down through vegetation and many other species. But they also help keep prey populations healthy. So wolves will often target the weak or the sick individuals in the population, and so that can have implications for the health of the prey populations. And so we've been kind of trying to think about that in the context of disease management, and how wolves and the way that they select their prey may be different from the way that humans, hunters, might select prey. And so one of those differences is that human hunters tend to select the healthy, biggest individuals from the population, whereas wolves tend to go for the smaller and sicker and weaker individuals. And so in terms of how that may play out in terms of disease transmission, we've been trying to look at that in a couple of different ways, and one is using a modeling approach with mathematical models to see how that works out. And we've also been doing a big literature review to see what the differences are in terms of disease regulation by human hunters and predators like wolves.
And there's another piece I'm kind of curious about, the paper that you wrote about like you mentioned, this was with Chris and Paul and a number of others, about the exposure of infectious agents in dogs in remote British Columbia. And I'm kind of curious if you could share a little bit more about that, about this idea about them being sentinels of disease, not just for people, but potentially in wildlife.
Right. Right, so there we were interested in understanding factors that might affect diseases in wolves, and dogs and wolves are very closely related, and so we were interested in understanding if there were some shared parasites between the populations. And I think the most interesting thing from that work was really that the coastal wolves had parasites mostly that related to what they were eating, and that those wolves had these really strong patterns of parasites related to their diet of marine resources. And I think it really supported how healthy this wolf population is, and how linked it is with these marine resources.
Yeah. And so here's a couple of different questions. I like this one. Can wolves hold their breath underwater, and if so, for how long?
Oh, I like that question. I'm not sure how long they can hold their breath underwater. I know they're pretty good at swimming above the water with their heads out. So I don't know, but.
Okay, thank you. And there was another question here that I'm kind of lost it, but question was around how many of these parasites are kind of detrimental to the health of the wolf or wolves?
Yeah, so wild animals like wolves live with parasites all the time. It's part of their daily lives. And most of the time, the parasites don't affect them much, especially if they have enough food. Sometimes in young animals, especially pups, some parasites that we were looking at can cause mortality. But in general, as long as the wolves are healthy, most of the parasites probably don't affect them too badly, especially if they have enough food. Sometimes if wolves are sick for other reasons, or if they're in poor body condition, that's when you might expect an effect of parasites. But in general, they're really good at living with their parasites.
And there's another question from before about that related to, you know, the distinction between coastal wolves and inland wolves is the extent to which those two populations interbreed or breed.
Right. Yeah.
So much we know about like the extent to which that occurs.
Right. So I think there's some genetic exchange between the island and mainland populations, but it's less. There's less interbreeding among populations than there is within those island and mainland populations.
And here's another question that's kind of that's another great question. Why are coastal wolves unique to Western Canada and not found elsewhere in the world? These are kind of seemingly straightforward, yet extremely complex questions.
Yeah, well, I think it's probably a combination of factors. Certainly on the coast mountains are kind of this geographic barrier there that could serve as sort of a barrier to dispersal. There's also potentially historical reasons related to the Ice Age and parts of the continent that were covered versus not covered, and the way populations kept recolonized and had refugia during the Ice Age. So there's some historical aspects that could be at play. And then there's a potential for ecological differentiation related to diet and landscape that could partly drive these genetic differences.
Thank you. Where are we at? So there was another piece here that I wanted to kind of talk about that's related to some of the things we've been talking about, like disease transmission, is that you're recently involved in like, I think it was an article rather than a paper, if I'm right, around human predators being hypermobile, and it kind of relates to this topic of disease transmission. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about what that piece was about.
Yeah, so that piece was inspired by this really interesting article by a Swedish ecologist, Atle Misterud. And he had speculated that human hunters might have a really potentially strong role in disease transmission, and particularly of diseases like chronic wasting disease and African swine fever. And so what he did is he looked at the movement of human hunters based on their postal codes and where they were hunting, and showed that there's this huge movement of potentially infectious material from animals that have been killed all over Europe. And then in contrast with the movements of predators that are much more localized, the potential for this long distance spread of disease is much lower. And so, it seems really simple, but very few people have actually done that yet. So, so Dr. Chris Darmont and I were invited to put a response or do kind of a summary of that paper. And that's where, we kind of built on it a little bit in just sort of speculating on some of the differences between human hunters and natural predators and how that might play out in terms of transmission of disease.
Okay, I'm gonna just throw these questions kind of randomly at you, and this one kind of relates to distance and travel. directly in what is the longest recorded distance that a wolf has traveled. And I want to add a question to that is, what is the longest distance that we know that wolves can swim in coastal BC? Because I think that's a question that it's easier to answer, but can you answer both of those?
Well, there was a neat paper that came out last year that looked at the longest migrating mammals in the world. And I'm pretty sure the answer to that question would be in that paper, but I don't have the number off the top of my head. I know they can certainly travel huge distances, and there's a really neat podcast by Mark Hebblewhite on Pluie the wolf, which is a wolf that Paul Piquet, I believe, collared with one of the first GPS-based radio collars. And that was a time when, back before those types of GPS collars were developed, if a wolf with a collar left the study area, people assumed it died or something, the collar had malfunctioned or something. But finally, when they were able to get these GPS-based collars on, they were able to record how far these animals were moving, and over huge distances. And so that one particular wolf, Pluie, is really symbolic of increasing our understanding of what kinds of movements these animals do on a yearly or bi-yearly or seasonal basis. So it's pretty, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it's pretty amazing.
And then I'm curious about the other piece, like whether that was just measured with a ruler or with a...
Right. Okay, so for the swimming, so this is a story that I've been told by, I think, Chris Darramont, and I believe he heard it from a pilot who observed wolves feeding on a whale carcass some 10 kilometers off of shore. So wolves were just feeding on the whale carcass and for a few days, and so that's I think the farthest I know of.
Wow. Okay. I'm gonna go. Let's have a look. One thing that was related to that theme we spoke a little bit about is that wolves are often kind of billed as this the ultimate predator, often for like dramatic effect on television and elsewhere, and you've spoken a little bit about their role in disease regulations. Paul spoke about their broader role on the level of the landscape, and I was wondering what you could tell us. Again, it relates back to the humans and our role, and a paper that you were involved with a few years ago about the idea of the human as the world's super predator.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah, so that paper was kind of the inspiration for the work looking at the differences in disease transmission. And in that paper, we were interested in understanding how the ecology of human hunters differs from the ecology of non-human predators like wolves and large marine predators. And so what we did is we surveyed the literature, and we extracted information about the proportion of the population that humans take compared with the proportion that non-human predators take. And what we found is that if you look across marine and terrestrial ecosystems, they're very different. So humans take much more higher proportion of the prey compared with non-humans. But if you look at specifically, and that was particularly pronounced in marine ecosystems. So if you focus then on terrestrial ecosystems, the main difference there is that humans and non-human predators take pretty similar proportions of the prey, but humans are essentially the only predators that kill other predators. So normally a cougar wouldn't kill another cougar. It happens sometimes, but very rarely. But we humans are, as top predators, tend to kill top predators at a much higher rate compared with non-human predators.
And this information I know it's on the Raincoast site, and I know it's one of the most highly cited or extremely well read papers that we've published. There's some different questions here, and so one that it's come up a couple of times in other episodes, so I want to ask it is, someone's asking how can they transition into wildlife conservation research, and is it realistic in your late 30s? What qualifications would be required? And lots of people have asked that. I think lots of people are asking, how do I become a Heather Bryan or a Paul Paquette or a Chris Darramont or others that are involved in that work?
I think we certainly, the more people who get involved, the better. And I think there's so many different ways to contribute to conservation science through community education programs. Professionally, there's lots of opportunities. I just think technology, if you depending on your background, if you have a background in data science, for example, there's huge data sets out there that can be used for conservation-based questions. And so having skill sets in data management, for example, can be really valuable. I think there's opportunities through education to help with that side of the conservation piece. There's opportunities through communication, science communication, and helping communicate messages around conservation and science. So I think kind of depends on your area of passion and interests and backgrounds. But I think there's a lot of ways to contribute.
Thank you. Yeah, I noticed that question's been asked a couple more times, so thanks for answering that. We have another question here. I'm just going to take a few different ones. Do wolves ever partner with other species to take down prey?
I'm not sure. Not that I know of. I've heard of the symbiotic relationship between species like ravens and wolves, where I've heard that ravens may help wolves find prey or kind of sort of partner there. But other than that, I'm not too sure.
Okay.
It's a good question for somebody like Chris Darramont or Paul Paquette.
Yeah, it's great. We anticipate questions that we can't answer, and we like questions that we can't answer. That's great. I'm just flicking through a few more questions here. And we've covered this on another episode, but I think it's a really important question, and I think we're going to circle back to this topic. Is how does killing of wolves affect the family unit?
Right. So, sorry, that was a question. Was that a question for?
Sorry, yeah, I think we're going to come on, because I know you've got some research on that, but I was just wondering if you could answer it kind of generally. Is also just how does killing of wolves affect that, the structure of the pack or the family unit? Sure.
Yeah. So it can have a variety of different effects. So one of the ways that it can essentially change the wolf pack social structure. So usually a wolf pack is a social group of animals where you have these younger individuals who are mentored by the older individuals in the pack. And so when you have a high mortality rate in the wolves, you can get the removal of the older individuals, and so you get younger individuals that don't have kind of that social stability of their family group. And so that can lead to a lot of different changes in terms of the genetic composition of the pack. So rather than having a social group that's mostly family members, you might have a pack that's made up of unrelated individuals. It can also change the behavior of packs. So you can get, instead of having just one breeding pair per social group, you might have multiple breeding pairs, and then you can get multiple litters per pack, or smaller packs each with a litter. So you can have this really, this effect on reproduction as well.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna shift because I really want to make sure we cover, and this relates to some of the questions that are being asked. Is some of your more recent research that is really important. So obviously, Raincoast and many other groups work on the conservation of wolves and numerous issues from the impact of wolf culls, the impact of recreational killing of wolves, and so on and so forth. And I wonder if you could share a little bit more about this paper that you did looking at the heavily hunted wolves and what we could see about the effect on populations of wolves that are subject to more heavier hunting.
Right. Yeah. So we know that the kind of heavy killing of wolves can lead to social disruption. There can be these genetic changes, behavioral changes, changes in reproductive patterns, changes in pack size, changes in the number and type of prey that are targeted. And so we were interested in knowing if there was a physiological difference that we could detect between populations that are heavily hunted and those that are less heavily hunted. So what we found is that the wolves that were heavily hunted had much higher levels of stress hormones and testosterone and progesterone, which are both reproductive hormones. And so what we think is those physiological signatures, and these were measured using hair samples of wolves that had been killed by hunters or trappers. And so what we think is that those physiological signatures reflect these behavioral and sort of structural changes in the packs.
And one piece that I found was really interesting is that this idea, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, is about how this stress might have evolutionary consequences via, like, and I'm kind of quoting from the notes of the paper that I read, via epigenetic intergenerational changes. So could you tell us a little bit about that and help translate that, like, just in terms of what does that mean, like that this potential for evolutionary consequences, and then also just tell us a little bit about what epigenetics actually are.
So, right. So we're learning, we know that genetic material can be passed from generation to generation through DNA, and that random mutations that occur through generations can lead to changes in DNA over time. But we're also learning that the DNA can change, or much more, well, partly DNA, but basically kind of short-term events that happen within an animal's lifetime can also be transmitted from generation to generation. And that can occur via epigenetic changes. So these are things like little methyl groups that get attached in different places in the DNA during an organism's lifetime that can lead to change the way genes are transcribed, for example. And so these changes can get transmitted from one generation to the next. And so there's potential for stress to not only have short-term effects on within an individual's lifetime, but there can potentially be long-term consequences passed down through generations resulting from severe chronic stressors.
And like this research is, that's an open access paper, so I'm sure we can make that available. And there's
I mean, we don't know what the consequences could be for wolves, and we're still learning what it means, for people who have experienced intergenerational trauma. But it's certainly an interesting concept and something that I hope we'll be able to learn more about and think about how major stressors for wildlife might be affecting future generations of wildlife.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question that kind of relates to this broader topic. Someone's asking, does it make sense to kill a whole pack or partially reduce a pack size to deter predation on cattle? So I wonder if you could just talk about, like, I know this is a huge complex topic, but and maybe just talk about like, do we even know that, like, wolf culls, like, what can benefit, like conflict reduction with cattle?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of really innovative work in that area, trying to figure out how to better coexist between ranchers and predators. So I think there's a lot of really interesting things that can be done to try and minimize those effects. Things like putting up fladry or using guard dogs, and trying to use kind of visual cues and things to try and keep the cattle safe. So I think I'm not an expert there, but I think there's a lot of really interesting techniques and approaches emerging. But it's challenging. It's been a challenging issue for thousands and thousands of years, and it's there's no easy solutions, but I think there are some interesting, innovative solutions coming up.
Yeah, and we do, like, although we're just completing our first kind of series, we do plan to look at these topics and kind of explore these a little bit more about these, how do we look at coexistence to not to minimize the fact that there is conflict with human interests in different places.
It's hard when people's livelihoods depend, and people have these really special relationships with their cattle, and it's very, very complex.
Yeah. And so, like, that kind of takes us towards, like, we're getting into our last 10 minutes. So I'm going to try and keep taking questions here. So please do post them if you've got some more, and we'll try and cover them. And this kind of relates more broadly to wolf conservation, and we discussed this yesterday, Heather, a little bit. Is I can sit here in Vancouver, and I eat meat sometimes, and when I get that meat, it's not from the bush. I get my meat, if I'm eating it, from supermarket, right? And I live in a very different place, and people in more rural areas, whether that's in British Columbia or elsewhere, may literally be in some aspect of competition with wolves if they're also using ungulates, deer, and so on for food source. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about, like, that's a huge topic, but also based on your experience, like, wolves are often seen as a bit of a scapegoat for say declining populations of ungulates. What you might be able to say about other ways of dealing with habitat disturbance that affects ungulates? Like, we talked about this a little bit, like some new different ways of dealing with this, and how we can potentially look at different ways of remediating landscapes that are actually impacted by habitat disturbance.
Right. Yeah, I think it's an incredibly complex issue, and for people who, like you said, depend on ungulate populations for their livelihoods, or for whom ungulates are incredibly culturally important. It's a very sensitive issue. I think that it requires careful consideration. I think, and obviously I think often these decisions should be made locally by the people who are affected by different decisions. I also think there's some really innovative approaches to trying to influence predator-prey interactions, and certainly a lot of the effects that people have had on landscapes has really influenced predator-prey interactions. So some of the work that's going into trying to remediate disturbed landscapes in a way that tries to that kind of influences those predator-prey interactions can help in that kind of situation. Another example is with fire suppression that has been really widespread for more than 100 years. And whereas in the past, many Indigenous peoples would use burning for wildlife habitat and other things, but in partly to promote forage, so food availability for ungulates, and sometimes these prescribed fires can also make it easier for ungulates to see predators coming. So there can be benefits in terms of promoting populations, and also we're making it easier to see and escape from predators. So maybe thinking about restoring kind of culturally appropriate burns for wildlife in areas where fire has been suppressed might be another way of trying to influence predator-prey dynamics and ungulate populations in kind of a habitat-based way.
Mm. And I wonder if you could say more about this piece about the idea of, or the importance of, looking at how management decisions can be made at a more local scale, like especially in the context of like even like wolf. I don't personally like the term wolf management, but with regards to dealing with wolves.
Right. Yeah, I think often it's the local people who observe ecosystems, especially Indigenous people who know the most about the ecosystems in which they live and have traditional methods for managing and coexisting with wildlife. I think it's those people, local people, who really should be making decisions about what's best. They know the situations the best, and I think it's encouraging to see more examples of local Indigenous-led management, and I hope that's what we'll see more of, that and more collaboration among different government agencies, both Indigenous and colonial government agencies, working together and really giving voices to local knowledge holders.
I'm going to ask you kind of a little bit more of a random question. I'm not sure if you can remember this piece of work, but I think at one point we put out a spoof that would be a management plan for human written by wolves. I think it was Paul's idea at the time. But I'm just wondering, like, and this is like a kind of flippant question, but it's getting towards the end. Like, if wolves had something to teach humans about ways in which we could coexist, and assuming that wolves could talk in a language that we could understand, what do you think that would be some lessons that we can take from wolves that might help us think about how we coexist?
I think that's a really good analogy, in that often when we talk about wildlife management, what we're really talking about is human management. So I have a feeling that's really what wolves would also be thinking.
It's more about managing our own activity than managing theirs. Yeah, okay. Yeah. There's a few, well, there's lots more questions. We won't get to them all. So I'm just going to pick a couple more because we've got some time here. Yeah, okay. So with wolves, there are documented accounts of surplus kills. And I'm curious, can you say, like, is that the case, and what might be the reason for that to occur?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can think of a few examples, and I'm sure there may be some more information out there, but sometimes if packs have been disrupted and they're smaller than they normally would be, then wolves might have to kill more often and may not be able to stay and defend their kill long enough to be able to move on, they might have to move on before they can consume the whole carcass. I guess another aspect to that is that that may be part of the ecological function of wolves, in that the remains of carcasses can get scavenged by many other species, smaller carnivores and scavengers, and so those carcasses may fuel ecosystems in other ways. So just trying to think about some examples of when that might occur, and also some of the kind of some of the ecological role that might have for other species in the ecosystem. I know, for example, Wolverines will often prey on wolf carcasses, and so there's this sort of relationship between wolves and Wolverines.
Yeah, and Paul spoke a little bit about this, like in terms of what we learned from places like Yellowstone and so on. We're just coming to, well, we're just at 7 o'clock, and I just wanted to see do a couple of closing pieces, but also note that the last question is asking again, who is the series dedicated to? So it's dedicated to Chester Staff of the Health Sick Nation, and I know a few people have mentioned him, and Chris Darramont and others will provide like a more fulsome remembering of Chester in our last episode. So thanks for asking us that question. We're just at time now, so I really just wanted to say, express our collective thanks to Heather for being such a fantastic source of knowledge and sharing all this information with us. We really appreciate you, Heather. I certainly really appreciate you, period, and we really appreciate you tonight for making the time. We really appreciate all of you for joining tonight, and our partners in this Wolf School, the Wolf Conservation Centre. If you want to learn more about wolves, then please visit the Wolf Conservation website, and you can also visit the Raincoast website. I think it's kind of fitting to also tell you about the next episode, because we're going to be talking about shooting wolves in the wild with cameras with Christina Mittermeier, and it's kind of it seems apt that we can see one of Christina Mittermeier's fantastic pictures over your shoulder, Heather, that Chris Darramont gifted you. So yeah, that's it. I'm pretty sure that's one of Christina's. So that's what that's who will be joining us for the next episode. So please tune in. And I'm kind of curious, I know we're just a little bit over time, but that's fine. Heather, if there was any last message you wanted to give our audience about wolves, or things that they could consider, or sources of information, what might that be?
I guess thank you for joining tonight. I really enjoyed chatting, and certainly think that it's a really neat program, and I'm glad that there's so many people interested and learning about wolves. I think I guess one thing that I've learned from studying wolves is that there's always more to learn, and there's always new things that you don't know, and so I think that's something that I think about a lot.
Yeah, that's a fantastic message to end with. There's wolves teach us that there is always more to learn. So we'll do our best to help sharing information about wolves. And with that, we're going to close and say thank you to Heather, and thank you to all of you. I'm going to end the broadcast, and we hope to see you next week. So good night and take care.